Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. On Fridays, my videos are called Responding to the Critics. We are currently reviewing and responding to a book by Mr. Brian Hodge entitled Problems with Preterism. Now, this book sets out to establish that Mr. Hodge is an expert on preterism and that he has the key to refuting covenant eschatology. And last week I shared with you something that is absolutely fundamental at the very outset of his book. And I've shared this with you, so let me reiterate it very, very quickly. Mr. Hodge has certain presuppositions at work. And look, we all approach the Bible with a certain degree of presuppositions. We approach the Bible that it is trustworthy, it's historical, true, etc., etc. However, there are certain presuppositions that when you're going to do biblical exegesis, and certainly when you are going to call into question the beliefs of a large number of people, then to just assume that your presuppositions are true and do not even have to be validated, do not have to be demonstrated as true, that becomes a very dangerous and a very serious situation. And here's what I mean by that. Repeatedly, and I'm talking repeatedly in the very first part of the book, I'm only up to page 23 at this particular point, and after I get through doing what I'm doing at the present time, I'm going to start going through chapters because I don't want this review to go on and drag on into 50 or 60 or 70 videos, and there's no need for that. So what I'm doing at this present time, what I began doing last week, is examining one of the foundational presuppositions of Mr. Hodge, and that is this. It is expressed on page 22 when he is talking about the book of Daniel and how preterists interpret the book. And he says of the book of Daniel, quote, according to the book itself, the author of Daniel is concerned about the time leading up to the persecutions of Antiochus IV, his desecration of the temple, his death, and the temple's restoration. This allows the reader to understand that the words in chapter 9 have to do with this time period and that Antiochus IV, is the ruler who will come and desolate the temple. The anointed leader, often translated as Messiah, the prince, actually refers to the office of the high priest who took upon a governing role after the return from exile and under the Seleucid, and is not referring to Christ at all. The time decreed for the Jews to make atonement for their sins and to bring in perpetual righteousness, i.e., a state of life that does not fluctuate between faithfulness to God and unfaithfulness to Him by throwing away their idolatry once and for all, is the extended exile about which Daniel is praying in Daniel 9, 1-19. In fact, this is what the text itself teaches. Verses 24-27 constitute the answer to Daniel's supplication that is brought to him by the angel Gabriel. The prayer concerns how long Israel will remain in a state of exile and oppression for their sin in light of the fact that Jeremiah said it would only last 70 years. The answer is that the exile has been extended, likely due to the principles laid out in Leviticus chapter 26, and that the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes IV would mark its end. This means that the time period for all of that which happens previous to Antiochus Epiphanes IV refer to the anointed high priest that precede him, not to Jesus Christ, who follows 200 years later. The anointed priest Onias III, who opposed the Hellenizing of the Jews, was killed under the reign of Antiochus IV by the rival Hellenized high priest that he installed, that is, that Antiochus installed. This marked a season of persecution that saw Antiochus come into the temple and sacrifice a pig to Zeus on the altar, thus causing the temple to be desolated. Well, there's an awful lot there, to be honest about it, that we could spend an awful lot of time on. But last week, as I suggested to you, what I want to suggest and what I want to do at this particular time is to demonstrate that Daniel 9:24 to 27 is not, in fact, dealing with the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, make no mistake, I am convinced that Daniel chapter 8, Daniel chapter 10, into chapter 11 also discusses the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. But that doesn't mean that Daniel 9, or by the way, Daniel 7, or Daniel 2, or Daniel 12 is talking about Antiochus. That would restrict Daniel from being diverse. In other words, that would say, basically, since Mr. Hodge does not believe that Daniel is giving actual prophecy, and you have to catch the power of that. Mr. Hodge is denying that Daniel was making an actual prophecy of things that were to come. Rather, he is living after the events. And by the way, it's not even really Daniel. It's not the Daniel of Ezekiel 14:14 at all. It is some pseudonymous person who wanted to give comfort and consolation to the Jews suffering at the hands of Antiochus Epiphanes. And so he took the name of Daniel to give credibility to his work, but it wasn't Daniel. And so as he writes under the pseudonym of Daniel, he writes as if he is writing and making prophecy. Now look, folks, we're pseudonymous. Why am I doing that? Pseudonymous authors a real thing in the ancient world? Yes, they were. But here's the deal. Pseudonymous works were not accepted as canon without some demonstration that although the name of the author was not the real name of the author, if you understand what I'm saying here. In other words, if they had a reason to believe that the work was inspired, then it didn't matter who the writer was. The book of Hebrews is a fine example. It doesn't claim to be written by Paul or Apollos or whoever. It makes no claim to authorship. But the contents of the book make the claim for its canonicity because of its content. So we have to really look at Mr. Hodge's presuppositions that the book is pseudonymous, that it's not really a prophecy, even though it says that it was predicting things to come. It really wasn't, says Mr. Hodge. Now, this raises a question, and so far in the book, I'll be very honest with you, I haven't read far enough to know, but it raises the question as to whether or not Mr. Hodge actually believes in such a thing as predictive prophecy, inspired predictive prophecy. And the reason I raise that question, you see, is because men such as John Collins, one of the most noted commentators on the book of Daniel alive in our world today, he says there was no such thing as inspired, infallible prophecy. As a matter of fact, when he is commenting on Daniel chapter 11, he says, well, here's the reason we know that Daniel was not a true prophet. Because after the following verses, everything that he said failed. You catch what Mr. Collins says? Here's how we know he was an actual prophet, because his prophecies failed. Now, I haven't read anything like that from Mr. Hodge, but when you deny that Daniel was the prophet, when you deny the author, when you deny that he was making actual prophecy, when you assert that he was writing after the fact, claiming that he was writing prophecy, it gives us every reason to doubt whether or not he believes in actual infallible prophecy. I find that deeply troubling. Now, in just a couple of weeks, I'll be debating Dr. Richard Carrier. Dr. Richard Carrier told me in private email, there's no such thing as prophets. By that he means inspired, infallible prophets with the ability to predict the future beforehand. He says they're just a bunch of guys running around saying things. That's his description. Well, that's skepticism in a thumbnail for you. So, I could go on and on and on about that, but be sure to tune in to Myth Vision, October the 12th, to watch my debate with Dr. Richard Carrier. Okay, now then. So what I began doing last week is demonstrating for you that what Daniel chapter 9:24 predicted, and yes, I believe in predictive prophecy. What Daniel predicted in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, in the 6 constituent elements of the verse, absolutely were not fulfilled in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, here's what's ironic about this. Since Mr. Hodge doesn't believe that Daniel was making true predictive prophecy, that he was writing after the events that he describes, then guess what? He should have pegged it perfectly, accurately, without mistakes. Don't you think? I mean, if this guy named Daniel, not really named Daniel, but calling himself Daniel, if he's writing after the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, after the pogroms against the Jews by Antiochus, after the period of the Maccabees, or even late in the period of the Maccabees, in which they recaptured the temple, rededicated the temple, rededicated the city, don't you think he would have gotten everything right as he predicted that? Now, I'm only going to focus on 3 constituent elements that we find in Daniel 9, verse 24. And he says, the angel told Daniel, 70 weeks are determined, first on the list, to bring in everlasting righteousness. Well, once again, Mr. Hodge says, oh yeah, this was fulfilled in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes died, and that we have the period of time of the Maccabees coming in and what have you. Listen, folks, make no mistake about it. The bringing in of everlasting righteousness was not accomplished in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Point number 1. Mr. Hodge suggested that Onias, the priest, was the prince that was slain. Daniel 9:26. The prince that is to come shall be slain in the midst of the week. That's supposedly Onias. Well, here's a question for you. Was the murder of Onias related to bringing in everlasting righteousness? No, it wasn't. Question number 2. Was the anointing of his 2 successors, his murderers, by the way, did the anointing of Jason and then Menelaus, did that bring in everlasting righteousness? Well, appointing 2 men guilty of murder as high priests doesn't make the atonement can't bring the atonement, and we'll have more to say about this in a bit. So appointing two men who were murderers as high priests could not bring in everlasting righteousness, and it could not make the atonement. Now, Mr. Hodge would almost undoubtedly say, well, the making of the atonement and the bringing in of everlasting righteousness, really, honestly, that was done when the Maccabees, under Judas Maccabeus, under Simon, etc., when they conquered Jerusalem, took it away from the forces of Antiochus Epiphanes, and they purged the city and they purged the temple. And they once again began to offer sacrifice on the temple. On the temple altar. Here's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. There is no qualified high priest to make the atonement sacrifice on the altar. There were none. Beginning with Jason and Menelaus, this is historically absolutely irrefutable. There were no qualified high priests to make the atonement in Israel. All you got to do is read a history of the priesthood from that time onward. And if anyone is even slightly familiar with what Josephus has to say about the priesthood in the time of the first century and for a good long period before that, Josephus believed it, the Essenes believed it, that the priesthood was corrupted in the time of the Maccabees because of Jason and Menelaus, and remained corrupted right to the first century. So let me ask you a question. How does the atonement get made when you don't have a qualified high priest? John Hyrcanus wasn't qualified. Simon wasn't qualified. Judas Maccabeus was not qualified. These were all men of blood. They could not serve as high priests. Not legitimately. So you got to ask yourself the question, ladies and gentlemen, how in the world was the atonement going to be made? How was sin going to be removed unless you have and without a qualified high priest who is the only one qualified to purge and to purify the altar and then to make the sacrifice, the atoning sacrifice on that altar? How's this done? You know, it seems to me that an awful lot of people who take the Antiochene perspective of the book of Daniel, Daniel 9 and the rest of it, they just simply haven't thought through what they're saying. They've got this bias against prophecy. They've got this bias against inspiration. And so they go all the way back to the time of Porphyry, an anti-Christian Jew who invented all of this, by the way. Porphyry, an anti-Christian Jew, invented the idea out of whole cloth that Antiochus Epiphanes was the object and subject of Daniel 9, Daniel all the way through. Never been known before that. He's the one that suggested it was written during the Maccabean period of time as if it were prophecy when it truly wasn't. So you can blame the invention of the entire Antiochene perspective of Daniel on an unbelieving Jew seeking to discredit Christianity. He was not an exegete. That becomes suspicious, don't you think? So, we move now, and no, I'm going to cut this short. because I do want to spend some time on the very next one, and that is 70 weeks are determined to bring in everlasting righteousness. Now, folks, this was supposedly, according to Mr. Hodge, done in the period of time of Antiochus Epiphanes. With the rededication of the city, rededication of the altar. Well, once again, we're going to see some things about that historically, theologically, and scripturally absolutely are false. So, I want to thank you for joining me on this morning's Morning Musings, a little bit shorter than my normal responding to the critic. Now, do not forget to join Mike Sullivan and me tonight on Preterist Apologetics. Boy, I tell you what, Mike has really been busy, or is getting ready to be busy. He's going to be interviewing Gary DeMar about the relationship between the Olivet Discourse and 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Then he's going to have some people on to talk about what's going on in the political realm today in regard to the one world government. And so be sure to join Mike with those, but be sure to join us tonight on Preterist Apologetics. Now, I promised you that for the month of October, I would have another fantastic two-book special. Last month, I had Sukkot, the Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, as well as Can God Tell Time as a free gift. Well, guess what? You don't get a free gift this month. I really didn't do my math very well last month. I did not help myself any at all with that special book. It was just way too cheap. Okay, this book, normally $25.95 plus $7.95 shipping. All right? This book, regularly, let me look at it again, make sure I got it right, $17.95 plus $7.95 shipping. That would be a total of $59.80. All right. For the month of October 2024, U.S. orders only. Okay, let me double check here. Total delivered price, $39.50. So you're going to save a solid $20. Now, the reason I am doing this and making this offer is because, as you know, I am currently doing a study on the feast days, and I'm focused at the present time on Sukkot. This book has a wealth of information on the meaning, the significance, the typology, and the fulfillment of Sukkot. Nothing like it around that I'm aware of. Now, since the feast days represented the climax and the consummation of Israel's eschatological hope, that means it has to do with the end of the old law, because it would all pass away when it was all fulfilled. So, in these two books, you're going to get companion books related to one another, yet still distinct. You're going to save yourself $20. So go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Look at the banner right up at the very top. Click on it. Save yourself $20 and get a wealth of information. Okay, thanks again for joining me. I'll see you tonight.